now. So Pauline, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to talk about Isabel Salt. As a reminder, I'm grateful for any questions in the comment box during the presentation, and there will absolutely be a time afterwards where we can have an open discussion. So Pauline, over to you, and I'll advance the slides as needed. And we're going to make sure you're off mute first. Because we can't currently hear you. So.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely can hear you now, brilliant.
But that's just by pressing the space bar down, which is temporary. To unmute myself fully, I've clicked on the, left-hand corner and it doesn't seem to do anything.
Well,
I can carry on.
You're all right, because I've got a little magic button on my side, so you're off mute.
Right, so I'm still with you.
You're still with us.
Good. Fine. Yes, well, thank you for those introductions. We're talking about Isabel Salt, yes, who of course is our independent woman, and the two industrial dynasties I'm sure you'll recognise as the Salts of Saltaire and the Crossleys of Halifax. And we've got at least one representative of Halifax here. It's nice to see David Glover, but I expect that for most of us, the Salts will be the more familiar people. And we will have a brief look at the end of the talk, just sort of how they were related to each other, what effect they had on Isabel. And it's always interesting to see these mill-owning families in context, really. But now to get back to Isabel Salt, the independent woman. Could I have the next slide, please? There she is. Looking rather bored. I'd guess her age at about 8. She was born in 1976. She doesn't look very enamoured of that knitting, and it may be imagination, but I don't think she's too pleased to be in fancy dress either. Her mother was very fond of putting the children into it. Could we have the next slide? So there our Isabel is again. Dressed again in frilly clothes and rather a nice hat. She's standing in front of her mother and father, and to her right is someone who's no relation at all, but is Princess Alexandra, the Princess of Wales. And I think she's just planted the tree, I think, and Isabel is the trowel bearer. And on the other side of the tree, you'll see the well-known figure of Edward VII, the Prince of Wales as he was then. There we are, we're back again with his cigar. Well, actually, one of the boys went and collected up a cigar butt and kept it after that. But you can see she didn't have an ordinary upbringing, really. Not many children are holding a trowel for the wife of the future heir of the throne. Next slide, please. And Milner Field, where they lived, was not an ordinary house either. It was built by Isabel's father in about 1870. It's rather unclear when they actually moved in from the census and so on, but that was certainly the most likely date. It was very large, with conservatories and large grounds, and with a boating lake. An impressive house, and certainly one that you could entertain royalty in. As we've seen, they were planting on the lawn, though there is a rumour that occasionally surfaces that Catherine and Titus actually evacuated part of the house so that there was room for the royal guests and their entourage. But we won't go into that here. It's not really relevant to the main theme. Next slide, please. Isabel's father, Titus Salt the Younger, he was in fact the youngest son of Sir Titus, but the one who took most interest in the business and helped to run it. And of course, he was also the builder of Milner Field. Next slide, please. And there is his father, Sir Titus Salt, taken in rather advanced age, I think. He was responsible, of course, for the large mill complex in Saltaire, together with the houses, institute, bathhouses, etc. And as well as this, he was the grandfather of Isabel. They never held a conversation. She was born in September 1876 and he died in December 1876. We can assume, I think, that he saw her and perhaps even dandled her on his knee, but there was never any proper communication between them. Next slide, please. Now, this view is taken from the north side of Saltaire, the other side of the river from the mill, and it's 1860, the date. Milner Field, the house of Titus Salt, was not yet built, but that would have been on this side of the river. And you can see the rural surroundings. Sir Titus Salt, I'll try to remember, they called the grandfather Sir Titus and the father Titus. Sir Titus Salt had been concerned to get his workforce away from the lack of hygiene and possible lack of mental hygiene too in the crowded courts in the centre of Bradford. So that was why he chose this very nice spot here to have his mill, of course, with other factors like the running water and so on. Next slide, please. Now, this is Isabel's mother, and this is where we come into the Crossley connection. She was born a Crossley, and the name of Crossley in those days would have had just as much resonance as would the name of Salt. They were at one time the largest carpet manufacturing family in the world, and their mills are still extant at Dean Clough. Next slide, please. There should be a slide of the mill, I think, just going back one. If we can't find it, it doesn't matter. It should be the next slide to this. Well, never mind. I'm sure quite a lot of people have been. There it is. The Dean Clough Mills at Halifax. Good for a day out. Good cafes there and things to see. It's a very large complex. So you can see that these were two, you might call them industrial giants that were the forebears of Isabel. Right, we'll have the next slide, please, that photo. Now, these are the three famous Crossley brothers who were largely responsible for running the mill. And the one on the left is Catherine's father and Isabel's grandfather. He was the quietest of the three. He didn't go in much for politics, and he was not mayor like the others were. But because of that, he sort of consolidated the business and died very well off, whereas the others, especially John, had some adventures with their money. Yes, I think we can say more about them later on. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, this is Arden Road Almshouses, a very nice complex of buildings which were built by Joseph, the grandfather. As I say, they weren't big building projects like Titus Salt, but this is a very pleasing little complex. There's still people living in it. There's still a chapel as it was when it was built. And it's on the way out of Halifax towards Rochdale. You can just see it on the left. There's a wall in front of it, but it is very worth seeing if you ever get a chance to go around it. So that was the sort of building Joseph went into, and it seems to suit his character, almshouses and a chapel. And the other two brothers did build housing schemes, but they were more sort of clusters of houses, not villages like Saltaire. There were other benefactions to Halifax, but not, as I say, large villages. Well, now we know about the ancestry of Isabel. Can we have the next slide, please? There we are again. These are the two descendants of the industrial dynasties. That's Isabel's brother standing there with his riding whip or whatever, or his cane. They look fairly untroubled at being the descendants of such distinguished people. And I think it must be the same occasion. Isabel's in the same fancy dress. And this picture's a good one. It's a sort of cue to say things about Isabel's childhood, because we're looking through her long life. And there are some clues to how her childhood was spent. It was life in a large mansion where the parents were host to royalty and where the children could have been very distant from their parents. But I don't think there were. There are some pieces of evidence. There were frequent visits from Catherine's Crossley family, and no doubt the aunts and uncles who came would be seeing the children as well as their sister. There's a talk about a visit from Louis Crossley. We'll go into this a bit later on when we talk about the Crossleys and science, but one of the sons, Harold, was called upon to play the violin to test whether a line between the mill and Milner Field was working. So he played his violin. I think he played the national anthem, and someone requested The Last Rose of Summer, but it was pointed out that he hadn't got that in his repertoire, so they had several more renditions of the national anthem. So it does sound to me as if the children weren't quelled in any way. The three boys had public school education, with the two older continuing to Trinity College, Cambridge. So far, I haven't found a record of Isabel's education. I would be very surprised if she didn't have secondary education to a good standard, as her mother was on the committee which founded Bradford Girls' Grammar School, which was one of the most advanced in the country when it was founded in 1875. So far, we seem to have been talking about a fairly happy childhood. However, there were strains behind the scenes. Next slide, please. There was a second royal visit, which wasn't as successful as the first. For one thing, they got Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, not the oldest son, Edward. But there'd been strains. They'd come to open an exhibition which Titus had hoped would pay off the debt on the school that he'd set up, the art school, to his father, who was dead by this time. But the exhibition actually made a loss for various reasons, and so there was a lot of money owing on the school. Titus had heart trouble, and it was known that he had. But one morning in November 1887, he walked through Saltaire, came home, and died at Milner Field of a heart attack, which, even though the family knew, certainly Catherine knew, that he wasn't a strong man, it must have been a tremendous shock to them. I'm just trying to do my arithmetic. He was 40 odd, 42. He was about 45, I think. So even though the Victorians died younger than we did, it was still fairly young. Could we have the next slide, please? Well, Catherine remained at Milner Field for another 16 years. Titus had left her about £69,000 in his will, and she also had a £2,000 annuity from her own father, Joseph, who had been dead for a few years, which was quite a good sum in those days. So she was able to maintain her standard of living. Entertainments continued there. Now, this is a dance program. This is one of my favourite objects in the collection. I think it's a very attractive little thing. It's the dance program, and you can see the pencil at the side. And it's probably from the ball which Catherine staged for Isabel in 1895 to bring her out, as the saying goes. Much fancy dress was worn. An account was sent to the Gentlewoman of the costumes that people wore. That was a magazine for ladies, and I think it's thought that Catherine actually sent the description. Next slide, please. Now, this is the point where our knowledge of Isabel ended before about 1914. The photographs which I've used up to now were in the Saltaire archives, donated or loaned by various members of the Salt family, certainly before 2000, but they didn't tell us as much of Isabel as an adult. The facts I shall mention from this time have come from various sources which have transformed our knowledge of Isabel and other members of the family. And I'm sure it's always a pleasure for a researcher if a whole stream of new information becomes available during their time of doing the research. And that's what happened to me. I'd been looking at Isabel. After I was looking at Catherine, her mother, I thought I'll have a look at Isabel, but didn't get very far with it. So I'm afraid I just gave up at that point. But then, as we moved on a few years, there was a donation of Isabel's letters, diaries, press cuttings, and some clothes. We'll hear about the printed things, the manuscript things, letters and diaries and so on later on. But there was a separate donation of textiles, and clothes, such as these slippers here, which I'm not being told, but I'm assuming were Isabel's bridesmaid shoes, because she was bridesmaid to her brother. There were things with the towels with the Salt family name on them, collars, that one collar had Isabel's name on it. So it was quite an intimate collection in a way, and they'd been saved. It was obvious that the family didn't go in for new apparel after every occasion or anything like that. And these have been preserved within the collection and well looked after. Myself, I've been more concerned with the material, the reading material, which came later, but this in a sense puts you more in touch personally with Isabel than even looking at her press cuttings and so on. Next slide, please. Now, the donation, which came a bit later, included several of Isabel's passports. This one's from a later date, from 1919, but it shows that Isabel was a seasoned traveller. Catherine had travelled in her youth. She'd been abroad on her honeymoon. She'd taken a holiday with her sister Margaret and her husband Titus, which had done a European tour when she was married. And she must have wanted her children, even though they couldn't take them as a couple, Titus was dead. She must have wanted them to have the same advantages. She, Isabel and Laurie, the brother, and her friend Mrs. Paisel and her daughter Louisa set off on a trip to the continent in 1890. Now, I'll just put a very brief comment there on Mrs. Paisel and her daughter. They were members of the German community in Bradford, which the Salts, certainly with some of the members, they were very friendly and they would mix culturally and go to parties and so on. This particular Mrs. Paisel and Louisa Paisel was mentioned in a recent novel by Tracy Chevalier, which someone might have read, I don't know. How much that's in the novel is authentic, I don't know, but Louisa Paisel was a real daughter and set off, a real person, and she set off on this trip with the Salts. Isabel felt it was obviously quite a serious undertaking, and she kept a diary starting with the words, "I suppose one ought really to keep a foreign journal for memoirs of a foreign land." So she obviously thought this was momentous. And she recorded their losing the Paisel family and their sandwiches in Paris. They did find them again, both sandwiches and the family. She recorded their walks through wet woods. They did seem to have a lot of wet weather. And teas with mother, using her portable stove for tea and rolls from the hotel breakfast. So it wasn't as if they went in for expensive feeding in the hotel dining room. And when Samuel Smiles, who was a self-help guru of the Victorian days, wrote his book on thrift, he chose the Crossley family as an example of thrift, which I think Catherine would probably have regarded as a compliment. But we didn't have any of this information about the trip until this diary, which she called the 13 3/4 diary, was discovered. And there's also information in it that Isabel had made other trips to Germany. In 1897, Isabel went to, in 1893, Isabel went to Germany on her own to stay with friends, sent back a few anguished appeals to her mother for some more money because she seemed to be running out, suggested her mother could get it over to her very quickly. In 1899, she had a further trip, which I think was independent of any of the family's friends there, because they did have friends there. And she has stamps on her passport for later dates, 1919, 1921, and 1922. And on at least the 1922 one, possibly the 21 and 19, it said it would let her have one trip into the occupied areas of Germany. So she was being quite adventurous going into Germany so soon after the war. Next slide, please. So I would ask you if any of you recognise that, but the bottom of 2 pillars and a sash window isn't really much to recognise it on. It's Denton Hall, which is near Benridding, near Ilkley. And in 1903, Catherine left Milnerfield and took the family there, those that were still with her. This wasn't really downsizing, as you can see from the size of the pillars. She'd sold Milnerfield to the Roberts family, and she was now renting Denton Hall from Sir Marmaduke Wyville. And it's not very familiar to us, but it was quite common to the well-off families in Victorian times to rent rather than buy. And we know that Sir Titus Salt had rented Crow Nest before he finally bought it. That was the house the Salts felt was their real home that they'd been brought up in. So this is Isabel holding her dog in the portico. And I've got the information from Nick Salt that the dog was called Max. I thought it was Rex, but Nick will know if anybody does. And this is a good time to review the stage of life that Isabel had reached here. She was 27 at the time of the move. Her mother, Catherine, was married at 20 and had her first child within a year. Catherine had followed the normal path, but her daughter was still unmarried. Which path would she follow now? We know from newspaper reports that she attended social events such as the Conversazione, but this couldn't constantly fill her life. She's a well-travelled woman with a knowledge of German from her travels. We don't know what her education was, but her speeches and press reports, which we'll see later, came to show that she was well able to express herself. Today, there would have been many careers open to her, but not then. There's one indication from this time of the direction she might be going in. She joined the Loyal Elizabeth Lodge in Shipley at its inception in 1901. This strangely titled body was a female-friendly society set up to help the poor to lay aside small funds to meet emergencies. There were some already, quite a few for men, and at this time, some were opening up for women. Isabel made a speech at the 2nd anniversary and also at the 3rd anniversary, though the family had moved to Denton Hall out of Saltaire by then. The gist of her message was that the different classes should not be as separate as they were. So there's obviously a bit of a political conscience arising there. And next slide, please. Something that pointed to her future had been happening in the years before this. This is a report in the Wharfdale and Airedale Observer in 1903. It's very blurred is the text, but I think you should be able to see the heading on it, the Women's University Settlement, Southwark. And this is Isabel giving a talk, I think it was to the Liberal Club, but anyway, in Otley in 1903. And she was describing a year which she'd spent at this Women's University Settlement. Now, there hasn't been any mention of this before, and unfortunately, she doesn't tell us when exactly she was there. But just to go into a little of what a settlement was, especially the university settlements, they were the places that were set up really to ensure more mixing of the classes. I think there was a feeling that the labourers had poured into the city centres and life there was very crowded. There wasn't any room for developing community feeling. You see, they were thinking about community feeling even then. And they were trying to imitate a rural village. And in this talk, Isabel says that, you know, we've left that rural setup, but we ought to be trying to do something about this. And the settlements were set up mainly with university students to go and live among the, in the city centres for a year. It says that they were for setting up recreation and education within the working classes. So I don't think that Isabel was scrubbing floors or anything like that. But she was obviously keen enough to do this for a year. It does make me wonder if she'd been to university, because it was university students that went mainly. She might not have been for a whole course, but she could have been for a year, because that's what some people did. Or alternatively, the settlements themselves, well, this one anyway, set up a sort of year's course in sociology. And I did just wonder if she'd done that, because there's obviously the interest there. Like so many things to do with Isabel, I'm sure future research will turn things up, but this is as far as I've got with it at the moment. Yes, we've talked about her being interested in the breaking down of class barriers. And when you think of her childhood, those sunlit lawns and the royal family on them, you feel that this is quite a contrast. Though, I mean, the family were involved in things like setting up picnics for the Sunday school children and things like that in the grounds. So there was sort of a mixing of both sides. They were very keen, Catherine especially, on entertaining the royals, but they also felt they had a duty to the work people. I know the question of paternalism and what exactly you make of Titus Salt and his village is, well, controversial, but I'm just giving you some of the facts of Isabel's life. Actually, you didn't get away from the elite even in this settlement, because in the Yorkshire Post of 26th April 1901, it's reported that Miss Helen Gladstone, the daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister, he was retired then, but the Prime Minister W.E. Gladstone, had accepted the post of warden at this very settlement. So how much she saw of the helpers there, I don't know, but it's quite possible that Isabel had had some contact with a daughter of Gladstone. And returning from the settlement and settled at Denton Hall, this social work certainly continued to be her interest. She joined the Wharfdale Board of Guardians, who were the body that administered local workhouses. Now, you wouldn't think that that was something to get up a great deal of enthusiasm about. It sounds more a matter of duty, but Isabel tended to throw herself into things with great enthusiasm, and so she did with this. She went on conferences and she went obviously on inspections of things, attended the meetings. And I suspect that previously people who went on the conferences had probably regarded it as a bit of a, time away, a weekend away or something. But Isabel came back with detailed and eloquent reports. The chairman commended her for these and urged others to do the same, but that possibly didn't endear her to other members. When Isabel finally left the area, one of the members of the committee commented, our meetings will be a great deal shorter now. So I think they thought of Isabel as rather a teacher's pet. Anyway, next slide, please. Well, it was inevitable that this concern for social issues should prompt her to move into politics. And the most obvious party was the Liberal Party. Her family, the Salt family and the Crossleys, had both been big Liberals. We'll talk a bit more about that at the end. So Titus Salt was an MP for a short time, and her great-uncle Francis Crossley was an effective Liberal MP on the radical wing of the party. This was the era of the Liberals' great struggle to push social measures such as the old age pension and the licensing bill through the House of Lords, which of course was trying to obstruct them. I think that generally crops up in history lessons, so I'm hoping people have a bit of a background in that, but the battle with the House of Lords, I think, is fairly well known. Isabel gave speeches on all these measures, not shirking the economic arguments. This is a sample of the posters for some of her meetings, both of them by courtesy of the Saltaire collection. This one is a meeting at the Ipswich Women's Liberal Association. Now, I don't know for certain why Isabel was in this area of the country, but I can suggest possibly two explanations. There's perhaps a clue in the name of the band. You'll see about in the middle of this poster, it says that the band of the Ipswich Social Settlement will be playing a selection of music. Now, this social settlement had been set up by Sir Daniel Goddard, a well-known philanthropist and Liberal MP, and he's the one who's hosting this meeting in the grounds of his house. He was obviously very keen on social settlements of the type that Isabel had visited in London, and I do wonder if she'd had some contact with him there. But there's also the point of contact that Sir Francis Crossley, Isabel's great-uncle, had owned Summer Leighton, which is near Lowestoft. And I don't know, it's the same part of the country. And I just wonder if Isabel could have been down on a visit to her relatives and got involved in this, or they thought they could have her as a speaker. If you notice, she leads the list of speakers. I don't know if that's because she's a woman and they're being polite, or whether she'd reached the stage where she was a sort of good speaker and they thought that they would put her at the list. But there she is. Next slide, please. So we've come back from Ipswich and come to Isabel's own home, a Women's Liberal Association to be held, a garden party to be held at Denton Park. And this is in 1909. Oh, actually, it precedes the trip to Ipswich, but never mind. You'll notice there's going to be some fun. There's the Otley XL40 Quartet Party Band. There's an afternoon tea, but I think you have to pay for your tea by listening to addresses by Mr. J. Hastings Duncan MP, who was the MP for Ilkley, and Mr. F.T. Hunter. And I forgot to look him up, but obviously there's a very serious part to this as well. Yes, I was just looking at the bits about people wishing to drive from Denton on the day. Could be taken there for sixpence each way. So they were going in Charabanc. So it gives you the sort of flavour of the meeting. So that's Isabel's getting involved in politics. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, once again, this is a very blurry slide, but it's a newspaper account of Isabel's speech at the Otley Liberal Club. Because of the COVID restrictions, I haven't been able to get into the collection at various points of lockdown and so on to get some of the clearer slides. But anyway, that's a very small thing compared to keeping your distance with COVID, which we all want to do. So what she's saying in this speech is, what could I say if someone got up in this meeting and asked why she interpreted the government of all the people as only half the people? She was insisting that including women in the vote was entirely a liberal principle. It was votes for all, not just for men. Having votes for all the men was just giving voting to half the people. Unfortunately, her constituency MP, Mr. J.H. Duncan, was not in support of the women's suffrage, nor was Asquith, who was the leader of the Liberals. And this was the position when the First World War started, and the women's suffrage put its main effort into war work, though of course the years leading up to the war had been very disturbed. The two branches of the women, the suffragists and the suffragettes, had both been competing to get attention and to get their side heard. The suffragists, of course, were against violence. The suffragettes would use it not against people, but against property. And there'd been a great deal of press attention and demonstrations and so on. But when it came to time for the First World War, that was put into abeyance for the time being. And by the time of the First World War II, Isabel and her mother had moved out of Denton Hall, and Catherine had gone to Thorpe Arch near Boston Spa. I think Isabel was with her, but it's sometimes quite difficult to trace where Isabel is. And, I don't think the fine answers about that have been reached yet. But certainly she wasn't in Denton Hall. And she took the war very seriously indeed. But she also saw that women undertaking war work needed equal pay, and said so very forcefully, as reported in the Shipley Times and Express, the 21st of April, 1915. And I'd like to read you one of her speeches about that. No, not the example I wanted. This is the one. At the outbreak of the war, this is Isabel speaking, at the outbreak of the war, 2 English lady doctors offered to provide a hospital for British soldiers. The offer was declined by our War Office, but accepted by the French government, and the lady doctors referred to had done excellent work. These same ladies had now been invited by our government to organise a military hospital at home, and one of them, Dr. Garrett Anderson, whom I'm sure many of you will have heard of, had been given the rank of Major. Applause. Women had gone forward prepared to drive and to keep in order motor cars, to saddle and groom horses, to interpret in 6 or 7 languages, and to serve in other capacities far too numerous to mention. Their splendid work in the nursing profession was recognised by everybody. Once again, applause from the audience. They had to deplore, however, the way in which professional nurses had been treated with regard to salary. Chauffeurs belonging to the Red Cross Society were receiving better salaries than highly skilled and highly trained nurses. Shame from the audience. They were all proud of the splendid response which had been made to the appeal to women in volunteer for war service. After all, it was only what might have been expected. So Isabel's keeping 2 things going. She's supporting the war effort, and supporting women's action in it, but asking that they should be properly remunerated for it. And as she said on another point, there must be equal pay for equal work. Next slide, please. This is the photograph from Isabel's 1919 passport, just so we have an idea of her as a young woman and not as a child. As the war continued, she became more and more distressed by the destruction and the militarism. One of her local papers was now the Harrogate and Claro Times, and in December 1915, writing under the name Candida, she pleads that the war had been going on for 17 months and has achieved nothing but destruction and misery. She still went back to give Saltaire to give talks, and many reports on this theme can be picked up from the Shipley Times and Express, especially in the Shipley Times and Express, 13th of December 1918, where Isabel declares herself pacifist and proud of it. And this illustrates another source of information about Isabel which became available, which is invaluable really. Within the last few years, the Shipley Times and Express was added to the newspapers, many of them local, which were indexed by the British Newspaper Archive, which is a computer database which you can search under subject terms, and a whole wealth of references then became available. You could have got them before if you had been through rolls and rolls of microfilm in public libraries. Some did keep indexes, but even so, you had to roll through quite a lot of microfilm to find them. And I must admit that myself, I gave up after getting migraine. But the fact that the British Newspaper Archive started on local newspapers has opened up an awful lot of local information. And I didn't intend to mention many people by name, but I would like just to thank Colin Coates, who was the first person who did this for us. And his reports started coming through about Isabel being a pacifist, Isabel being a suffragist, which were, of course, extremely useful. Some of this material is backed up by Isabel's speeches book, her cuttings book, which is now in the collection, but not all. So both sources are very valuable. And another fact that we know from the newspapers is that Isabel also became a member of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, in 1918. A big change when you remember that Isabel's family on both sides, the Salts and the Crossleys, with a few exceptions, were strong Congregationalists. And a second major change was her political allegiance. As Isabel said, also in the Shipley Times and Express, 13th December 1918, she had always been a Liberal, but she was now on the Labour side because she had found no outlet for her principles in the Liberal Party. And by her principles there, she meant her suffragist principles. And it's interesting that which came first. I'm sure it was a real sort of well, it was difficult for her to give up on the Liberal Party when she'd been brought up in it and she'd been introduced as the granddaughter of, outstanding Liberals. But she was willing to follow her conscience, and that this was the cause that she most wanted to support. The occasion when she said this was when she was supporting Tom Snowdon, who was the brother of the more famous Philip Snowdon, the first Labour Chancellor. So in the years between 1918 and 1923, Isabel seemed to concentrate on writing or speaking about the need for a League for Human Rights, which would unite men as individuals without membership of a specific race getting in the way. There is more prominence given to religion in her writing, but I can't find the controversial letters to the editors and enthusiastic speeches at local meetings at any time up to her death in 1968. I did do another scan of the newspapers, especially of that later part, just in case newspapers had been added. They are added all the time, which might produce something relevant, but I couldn't really find anything. So one explanation might be that some of her causes had been partially fulfilled. Women over 30 with a certain property qualification had gained the vote by the Representation of the People Act of 1918. Isabel, of course, would be keen to bring the others in, but part of it had been fulfilled. The war was over, and although there was still need for international agreements to prevent another, the death toll and the atrocities weren't at the front of the newspapers all the time. So perhaps pacifism wasn't such an urgent issue, though Isabel was trying to build up, organisations that would prevent other wars. Another factor in her silence may have been that she had left her family's traditional allegiances to the Liberal Party and to the constitutional denomination, and her name probably didn't carry the same force either in the Labour Party or among the Quakers. But I do feel that Isabel would have made herself heard somehow or other if she had really wanted to. In fact, whatever the reason, her life underwent a great change in the 1920s. In 1925, she set up a residence in Oxted in Surrey. No reason is known for this move. It's quite a distance from Harrogate to Oxted, from her family situation, from the links she'd built up with newspapers and organisations, from the people, the people of the women's organisations that she'd been on committees with and so on. And her mother continued to live in Harrogate and didn't die until 1930. Although she and her mother had been living in separate houses in Harrogate since 1916, it is quite surprising to find that she moved so far away when her mother was certainly getting on about 79. And one thought that occurred to me just as I was doing the talk was, where did Isabel get the money from to buy these houses on her own? I'm pretty sure that Oxted was bought, not rented, though I haven't looked into that, but I think we can assume that. Catherine, her mother, had been left everything to deal with by her father Titus. That was quite a simple will, everything goes to Catherine. Whether her mother had decided that she would help Isabel out to buy a house, which I know happens with parents now, but I'd have thought it was very unusual between parents and girl children at the beginning of the century. But as I say, that was just something that occurred to me, so I thought I'd write it down. Now, there might have been one reason behind Isabel's move. She was helping to bring up a child in a family in Oxted and paying for her schooling. So most of her energies may have been consumed by the child known as Betty, who was from a local family, Betty College Steele, I think it was. She wasn't actually removed from her family. She wasn't adopted, but Isabel did pay for her education, boarding school education. And this child, who married later and became Betty Wilmot, she preserved the items that I mentioned earlier, which Isabel left when she died in 1968, the letters, the diaries, the news cuttings and the textiles. Betty's daughter, Penny, has visited us in Saltaire and said she remembered being taken to see Aunt Salt, i.e. Isabel, and Aunt Salt was fun, which you know, I was quite pleased to know, because you wondered if Isabel had just sort of retired down south in a fit of melancholy or something, but at least she could enjoy time with the children. Betty's daughter in turn preserved these, and they were eventually deposited in the Saltaire collection at Shipley College. So it's thanks very much to Betty and her daughter for preserving them, because they're quite invaluable, this whole collection. As I've mentioned, the press cuttings, but diaries, letters, and quite bulky too. So preserving them, you know, would have taken up some space in various households. And it's also thanks to Nick Salt, Isabel's great-nephew, for contacting the BBC to trace them, because they had appeared on an edition of Antiques Roadshow with a beautiful doll that belonged to Isabel, which was called Salt. And having got on the track of that, Nick, who has contacts in the BBC, got the name of the person, made contact, and the stuff was deposited in the collection with the goodwill of the person who owned it. I think was very happy that it had found a good home. So there've been various sources of information on Isabel. As I say, as you get towards the end of her life, well, it's not really the end of her life. She lived till 1968, but from 1925, 26 or so onwards, there isn't really a lot of information. We can tell her birth family was still important to her. Her nephew, Dennis Salt, the son of her older brother, Harold. Can we have the next slide, please? Dennis was a frequent visitor to Saltaire. I'm sure many of you would remember him. He's seen on the right of this picture. He was born in 1918 and he died in 2014. So he'd spanned a very long period of the family history. And in the collection from Isabel, there are records showing that she paid his fees at Oxford. And she also saved a very good report on him from his tutor. The receipts for the fees are interesting. It's amazing how these mundane things can throw light on history, because you get a receipt for fees paid, I think it was between 39 and 40, or possibly 38 and 39. And then Dennis went off to the war. And I think the next receipt is something like 1944 or 1945. And he finished his course and was very well spoken of. He had a good career with the BBC, which must have been a great satisfaction to Isabel. I was very lucky to meet him briefly on one of his many visits to Saltaire. I know most of you will know him far better than I did. But I asked him then if he had any memories of Isabel. And he said, "You always knew when Aunt Isabel had come into a room. She could never be ignored." And so he would know her in a later day. She still retained that, well, what you might call personal magnetism, I assume. So it's interesting to get sort of the family side light on her there. It's obvious she had a great interest in Dennis, but by the time of her death, Betty, whom, as I say, she had helped to educate and to look after, seems to have been the closest person to her. She refers to Betty in her will as "my friend Rosemary Edith, otherwise Betty Wilmot, whose unfailing love and loyalty has always meant so much to me, and to whom my house has always been a second home." It is clear that Betty is the main beneficiary of the house, Springwood, and other property. Isabel does mention Dennis and his brother Peter as beneficiaries, but only if Betty predeceased them. And I've just reminded me, reading about Rosemary Wilmot, Betty Wilmot at this point, that the donation of textiles and wearing apparel and things that we had first of all into the collection was by Betty's son, who was Barnaby Wilmot. So we've received two collections from that family, both of great value. Well, I don't think Isabel forgot her Saltaire roots. She did write, there's a letter from her in one of the local papers when it was announced they'd be celebrating a centenary of the church and that there'd be a booklet written. She asked for a copy of the booklet. But I don't know that she ever came back to Saltaire. That's another thing that may well get discovered later on. Her death took place at Broom Hall in Bognor Regis on 21st of May 1968, when she was 91, and her home was still Springwood in Oxted in Surrey. The first paragraph in her will specifies that she wants her eyes to be donated to the Queen Victoria Hospital, East Grinstead, and she stresses that she is a lifelong member of the Cremation Society and her ashes should be scattered in her garden at East Grinstead. Pause as I look at that and think, why East Grinstead? Anyway, we'll put that on one side for a minute. That's definitely what's in the will. Even after death, Isabel wanted to make sure that her wishes were carried out, as she had a Cremation Society card which stated that the fee for my cremation is prepaid. So that's what I wanted to say about Isabel. Time's going on a bit, but I just wanted very briefly to say something about those two dynasties that Isabel sprang from and that she then took an independent path from. At least I think she did. So the origins of the family were similar, though the Salts came from a slightly more prosperous stratum of society than the Crossleys. Titus Salt was the son of Daniel Salt, a wool stapler, and the family could afford an education for him at Morley Grammar School. John Crossley, the father of the three well-known Crossley brothers, Joseph, Francis and John, had to struggle to establish his business, and his wife Martha is said to have risen at 4 a.m. to make and stitch carpets. The three boys had some time at local schools, Heath School in the case of Francis, but he had to come home and work at the loom afterwards. Hard work and thrift were obviously ingrained in them. Both families progressed through the 19th century, taking the opportunities which were available to energetic and enterprising entrepreneurs, and finally had the biggest firms in the area. Crossley's was said to be the largest carpet manufacturers in the world. Both embarked on building schemes, although Titus Salt's project, the whole village of Saltaire, complete with different facilities, was on a larger scale than anything the Crossley brothers undertook. The Crossley brothers definitely had a family tradition of philanthropy, arising from the time when Martha Crossley, wife of John and mother of the three brothers, vowed that the poor should taste of the results of their prosperity. There were many donations, but the most striking was Francis Crossley's gift of his People's Park to the citizens of Halifax. This was inspired by a visit to the States, and after seeing all the natural wonders there, he wanted to give some wide open spaces to the people of Halifax. There was also another large project, which was the construction of the Crossley Orphan Home and School, opened in 1864 and undertaken by all the brothers. Sir Titus Salt gave big donations in the shape of buildings in Saltaire, the Congregational Church and the Institute. He also gave generously to many charities. Among his charities were Bradford Town Mission, Bradford Children's Homes, the Hull Seamen's Children's Orphanage, the Bradford Grammar School, and the Bradford Girls' Grammar School, and he was very careful to give a gift to the Girls' Grammar School because he said that the sisters, i.e. the girls, deserved their education as much as the boys, and that was quite a revolutionary thing to say in the 1870s. So against this background of a consciousness of humble origins, giving rise to an awareness of poverty and a wish to relieve it, it's not surprising that Isabel developed a concern for the poor, but possibly her wish to see the mixing of the classes was an extension of her own making. Both families were interested in science and innovation. The most outstanding example of this is the large telescope erected by Catherine's brother Edward at his home in Bremerton in Halifax. The Salts didn't do anything on quite this scale, but there was an interesting joint enterprise in 1882 when Albert Sachs, a Bradford photographer, photographed the conversazione at Salt's Mill, a startling innovation at that time. Prior to this, in the afternoon, was a lecture for children. It was given by a Professor Barrett from Dublin, and it was on electricity. And he was ably assisted by Lewis Crossley, this was a cousin of Catherine, who provided much equipment so that this could be photographed as a rehearsal for the photographing of the conversazione. So though I would say the Crossleys were much more of a scientific bent, Titus was very interested in what they were doing, and was glad to join in it. He was also a very practical and skilled man in the making of wooden lathe in wood, doorknobs and, wooden ornaments. There was also an experiment connecting the mill and Milner-Field by telephone. I think these all happened on the same day. But there was an interesting email that came to Saltaire recently. I think it was Stephen Lightfoot, detailing this information, and it's another link between the Crossleys and the Salts. And incidentally, I can't resist putting this in as part of that children's lecture on electricity. I've probably got a completely wrong picture of the Victorians, because I would have imagined the children sitting on chairs listening to the professor spouting. But it says a tramway was laid out across the hall to illustrate the power of the Siemens magnetic engine. Children rode the tramway, which was propelled by the hidden force, in quotes. And this all ties in with Titus's interest in the Froebel system of learning by experience. I wonder if Isabel and her brother actually rode on that train. I think the two older boys would have been a bit too old. One of the most important connections, both families belong to the liberal tradition in politics, which fostered individual responsibility and encouraged progressive causes. Jack Reynolds says of Titus Salt, he was always a member of the inner circle of well-to-do radical dissenters who played a leading role in the reformation of Bradford's public life. He became a Liberal MP in 1848, but did not make a speech. His influence on the Liberal Party was much more local than parliamentarian. But Francis Crossley, Isabel's great uncle on the Crossley side, had a much longer time in Parliament and was eloquent on such things as the Reform Act. So I suspect that Isabel probably took after her great uncle in that respect, rather than her Salt grandfather. But we've seen that Isabel was capable of striking out on her own path. I've already mentioned that she left the Liberal Party and how she said that she had no outlet for her principles there. So she was departing from the family tradition there. We mentioned joining the Quakers, which once again was leaving the Congregational Church, which had seemed like two pillars of the Salt and the Crossley family. There is, of course, the point that when she started to change her opinions, it was after the First World War, and we know what a tumult and a turmoil that caused and how the world wasn't the same after it. And I think Isabel said something very similar about that she had always been a liberal, but new ages provided new causes and you had to go with the times. So she showed independence of thought, and in some ways I'm very surprised that she didn't go on, perhaps on a different tack, but through the 20s and 30s, because it was the time of the activities of the Peace Pledge Union before the Second World War. And I'd have thought that being down in the south, because I think a lot of demonstrations were in London, that would have given her some, some opportunity. But like I say, there seems to be a silence after that. So I'll suggest one or two possible reasons for this, and perhaps if there are any questions, people might like to suggest some more. One of them I thought of was a sort of religious conversion, the talk of the Quakers, and she becomes much more almost mystical in her talks, that might have made her feel quieter and not as willing to engage in controversy. It could have been illness. She'd have been about 45, late 40s when this happened, and it might have been the menopause. She might have, found it difficult to keep going, but it is a long period to keep going after that. Some people suggested a love affair, but so far we haven't found anything about a love affair at that time. Now, what was the other one? Love affair? That Betty took up a large part of her time? I just don't know. But the intriguing thing about Isabel is that we by no means know everything about her. This is trying to draw together some of the strands that we do know, but I hope we'll find more, and I hope people might like to suggest more. So that's the end of what I'm saying. I'll hand you back to either Les or to Rachel. I can't remember which one was taking over now.
Brilliant. That was terrific. Thanks so much, Pauline. I have hopefully turned off the slides, which will put more of us back on the screen.
Yes, you have.
And I'm going to hand over to Les, because Les has been keeping his eye on the chat box. I haven't been able to see it while the slides have been up, to just ask if there's any comments or questions to start this discussion going.
Well, we've got only one question, but we've got 4 hellos from different people, including David Glover, who was mentioned earlier on, who's from Halifax. And hopefully we'll see him in about 3 months' time. From Sheena, the World Heritage Officer. And from Jane, who says, I'm Jane Wood from East Lancashire. So it's great. We're actually reaching out to the poor benighted persons on the Red Rose side of the Pennines. So that's great. There's one other question, one question I put in, and another question just coming in as well. My question was, how did Isabel make the initial connection with Betty? It seems really a bit bizarre, that. Can I leave that with you for the moment, Pauline? Just mention the other contribution. And others, Dave Shaw would like to ask a couple of questions as well, Rachel and Pauline. But Sue Holden says there is a resource regarding Louisa Pacell. It's mentioned at the back of Tracy Chevalier's novel, A Single Thread, and she gives the internet URL connection there, if we can pass that on to you, Pauline.
Thank you very much. I know I'm pretty sure there's a collection of her embroidery and things somewhere. Does it refer you to that?
No, it just meant, well, it's called A Single Thread. So
yeah, that's the novel.
That's
yes.
a connection, isn't it?
A musical contribution.
The city of Bradford grew out of immigration, whether it be the German wool barons, the Irish, or the mill workers from Eastern Europe. Bradford has always welcomed new people. In the 1950s, Pakistan, Bangladesh.
We get all sorts of members at the meeting, don't we?
I didn't quite catch that.
I said we get all sorts of members at this meeting, don't we?
It was what I couldn't catch was the previous thing, what you were commenting on, yeah. Rachel, Dave, can you bring Dave Shaw in? He's got a couple of questions.
Hello, Dave. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Dave?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Pauline. That talk was tremendous. Really wonderful. Just passing before I ask my questions, the very last slide that you showed when you spoke about Dennis, the gentleman sitting on his left is Jonathan Salt.
Ah.
And Jonathan knew Isabel. He would, as a young person, he would visit Isabel down in Oxted. So, and he's hoping to be back up here next year, and we should pick his brains further about that.
Yes, I've been thinking. Sorry, you go on.
Yeah, more importantly, I think, to me, what the most interesting development, I'd not heard about this, but you've discovered this women's university settlement in Southwark. I cannot help but feel that that was a fairly fundamental period in her life. If she was living down in London for a year, you could well imagine her values changing. I think it'd be very interesting. It might throw light on her education. If there are any archives for that settlement, to see,
there are.
Do you think her name would feature in those archives and as measures of her academic achievements?
Well, I did wonder about this, and I went to several websites. I was hoping that some of them might have been digitized, but I think that they just exist in printed form in, was it the Women's Library? There were some in the Women's Library in London, and there were some in another collection, but I couldn't see any way of getting at them short of going to London. But like you say, there are the annual reports and meetings and so on. I didn't see any sort of list. I'd have liked to know if they listed the helpers, such as Isabel. But certainly it would be good to browse through those and see if it did give any indication about Isabel, what sort of work she did, what her previous education had been. So yes, that is a source. I mean, I've no plans to visit London at the moment, but at some time in the future, it would certainly be good to tap those. I think it's though you see, she must have had the interest in social work and the poor to go down there, mustn't she? So something must have started in her before that. But it is quite a commitment to go down for a year. And I would imagine that they wouldn't be sort of going into people's houses all the time or anything, but there might have been a bit of a health risk by going to a very crowded area like Southwark. So it was quite an enterprising thing to do.
Yeah. The other place that you mentioned she may have visited is Somerleyton.
Well, I just wondered.
The Crossley on. There is an archivist at Somerleyton Hall.
Oh, is there? Yes.
Yeah. And I wondered if they have any record of Isabel's visit or visits there, which could be quite revealing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. I'll contact them.
Okay, that's my lot. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yes, I had wondered about the man who was sitting next to Dennis Salt, and I'd been going to ask you when I got the opportunity. So I'm very interested to hear it's Jonathan Salt. Yes.
Yeah, and Jonathan's son, Ben, yet another generation, and they seem to get taller with each generation, Salt. Ben Salt is a member of our club. The History Club.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if he's tuned in at the moment, probably not, but he's certainly in contact with the History Club through Facebook, for example. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you very much for that. Do I reply to this, Les, about Denton Park, or do you put it to me? I'm not sure what the etiquette is.
That's fine. You pick up on that. I've got a couple of other ones that I'll draw to Rachel your attention after you've done that.
I think someone just said, where is Denton Park?
Yeah.
And well, it's in Ben Ridding, and if I had a map I could show you, but it's the other side of the river from Ilkley. It is quite near, and it's now used as a weddings venue. So I've always thought at some time I would sneak into a sort of wedding preview, because I know they have these days, and get an idea of of what the place is like. But I'm told there's very little left of the original in it.
Just to say that it's a very big house, and if you go across the river from Ilkley to the northern side of the river, it's difficult to miss. It's that big house in its grounds, so it's yeah. We've got a couple of more things on here, Rachel and Pauline. One is Sue's mentioned something about this Louisa. I can't remember her second name now. I wonder if she'd like to say something. That's Sue Holden. Are you there, Sue?
Just a second. A minute.
Yeah. Hello.
No, I mean, I know nothing about the lady, but I mean, it's strange. I only finished that book last night. And
I thought someone would have read it.
And then you mentioned the name. I thought, my goodness. So as you've been just latterly talking, I was sort of Googling around a bit, and she seems to be an absolutely fascinating woman who lived in Egypt and Greece, and from a middle-class family in Bradford. And I was just wondering, she's obviously contemporary of Isabel. I'm just wondering if they knew each other from the West Riding really.
Well, they went on holiday together. It was Catherine and her mother and brother, and Mrs. Paisel and her daughter Louise Paisel. I can't. Is it Louise or Louisa? I couldn't remember which.
Louisa.
But she was the person who was on the holiday. And
I missed
they
that
lost
bit.
them in Paris. Yes. Yeah. So
Right.
she was. I mean, I don't know how many of the attributes in the novel are the attributes of Louisa Paisel. I'm pretty sure she's associated with embroidery and fine work.
Oh,
But,
yes, yeah, that's what she taught. Yes, she was in charge of the broderers at Winchester Cathedral. She was invited to go there because she was so sort of highly qualified. But she actually taught embroidery to recovering soldiers and this kind of thing. So she obviously had that sort of, that link that I've just put on, actually, the second one, it's a fascinating read in itself. And I'm sort of prompted to find out more about her. And she just
I'm just looking for the link. I don't want us to lose it. Have you got the link in the chat box?
Yeah.
Les?
Yes, I have. But actually, it's the link is quite memorable. It's a website called www.notjusthockney. I've lost it now. Sorry, everything's gone off.
Yeah.
Yes.
Come back. Oh, there we are.
Info. Yeah.
And I noticed someone's put on that Louisa went to Bradford Girls Grammar School. Yes, she did. And her mother was very much involved in the founding of the grammar school as well. That's the Mrs. Paisel that accompanied them on holiday. There was this committee of Bradford women who got together to found a good secondary school, because good secondary schools for girls were almost impossible to find. One of the motivations was they didn't want them to go to boarding school, they wanted to keep them at home. And that was the genesis of Bradford Girls Grammar School.
Right.
So yes, I'm pretty sure Louisa was a pupil, because I did look at some of the pupils at one point. I think she was among them.
Yeah, so this notjusthockney.info site has obviously got a number of biographies of people who are not Hockney but come from Bradford. that's the point of the thing, I think. But yeah, we've got that URL there. Could I suggest, Rachel and Pauline, that David Glover says something. He's got a couple of bits of chat here, and he is our Halifax and Crossley expert who's with us tonight.
Good evening, everybody. These are sort of lateral connections. Denton Park was lived in by Sir James Ibbotson, whose family made money in Leeds, and he married the only daughter and heir of John Cagill, who founded the Peace Hall in Halifax. So there's a strong Halifax link with Denton Park in the later part of the 18th century. It's curious that Denton Park also attracted another Halifax link around about the third quarter, perhaps the fourth quarter of the 19th century. Some of you will have probably heard of a rival industrialist in Halifax called Colonel Edward Ackroyd, who founded Ackroydon and had a great big worsted business in Halifax. Now, his brother Henry Ackroyd, not so well known by a long way, who was originally in business with Colonel Edward, but eventually opted out. He went to live at Denton Park, which he rented from, at the time, I think it was from the Ibbotson descendants, but Marmaduke Wyville, who was mentioned by Pauline, was also a descendant of the Cagills and of the Ibbotsons. It's just extraordinary how you find these lateral links, which probably mean nothing to most of you, but they fascinate me because they all connect us. Denton, Halifax, like Pauline, of course, is so excellently connected Crossleys and the Salts tonight. Thank you so much, Pauline.
I'm wondering whether there's a couple of other people who've put a little piece on the chat. I wonder if any of them would like to say something about what they've asked about. They won't. No, I think that's it.
I'm sorry, Les. I just was trying.
Hello, Maggie.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure it is the same place. But and thank you, Pauline, for a fascinating talk. But is Denton Park the same as Denton Hall?
Well, Denton Park surrounds Denton Hall, yes.
Right, because I think you said it was in Benridding. Is that right? Because I thought it was the other side of the river.
Yes, and I must admit, and Les will agree with this, that the location of Denton Hall is a bit mysterious. It's the other side of the river, and I did look this up on a map at one time, and I think that is labelled as Benridding over there. But all I can suggest is having another look at the map, because at one point I thought you got to it straight over the river from the garden centre just outside Otley, but you don't. I'd telescoped 2 trips in my mind. I know it's the other side of the river and it's nearer to Ilkley, but I couldn't tell you exactly where it is.
Well, if you're coming down the road past the Cow and Calf Rocks into Ilkley and you look over the valley, there's a very big Georgian style building, which is often illuminated in the evening. And that is my understanding of where Denton Hall is.
The other side of the river, yes.
Yeah.
But I'd associated Benridding with the other side of the river from that, if you see what I mean. So I can't really shed much more light on this, but I know it's the other side of the river from Ilkley. And I know it's also referred to as Benridding, and I can only sort of hold out those 2 bits of information see if anyone can reconcile them. But it's certainly that building, as you saw it with the pillars, and it is certainly a wedding venue now.
It's postal.
Or it was when I last went. Perhaps it isn't. Sorry, someone said.
Its postal address is definitely Ilkley, Pauline, because I looked it up after we talked about it previously.
We talked about this, didn't we? Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely Ilkley postal address. Over to you, Rachel. She's gone off for a cup of tea.
I think she needs one.
Come on, Rachel. You're supposed to be looking after us.
I'm getting myself off mute. I was following the rules. So if there are no further questions, and I see that we're just a bit off 8:30, I just thank you again, Pauline. That was absolutely brilliant. And I want to run to the books now and see if I can answer any of the questions that you have left us with, because it does sound like there's a lot more to explore there to continue to build the story. So thank you on behalf of everyone here tonight. That was absolutely brilliant. And Les, would you like to say just a couple closing words before we close for real?
Yes, I would. I'd like to, first of all, thank everybody for turning out tonight. Even though the weather was very bad, everybody's turned out and come to the meeting. Fantastic. And what I'd like to wish you all is a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I'd like to see some of you, at least, hopefully all of you. I see a couple of the speakers for the next meeting. I'd like to see some of you on the 4th of February, when we're going to meet at 8 o'clock for this research workshop.